For adding a creative touch to your strokes, we have a texture option. Let's discuss it here. This option works more creatively with the graphic pen. If you have that, it's an added advantage. The texture option will add texture to your strokes. Select the texture from the topmost drop-down. Select a soft brush from the brush tip shape. Now draw a stroke and you will find the rough edges on the stroke. But we want the texture in our stroke and not only on border. Now reduce the depth enough so that you can see the texture in the stroke in the bottommost window. Now draw another stroke. It looks better than the previous stroke. Though the texture is colorful, the brush draws a monotonous stroke. The reason is the texture option converts the image to black and white and fills the stroke only on the dark area of the texture. You can invert that by selecting the topmost option of invert. We have different kinds of modes to draw the texture on the stroke. Depending upon the texture and the mode, you might need to change the depth. You can try out the different options. The current option is height. This option will treat the black or dark color in the texture as an opaque area and light color areas as a transparent or less opaque areas. You can change the texture scale, brightness and contrast according to your choice. The brightness option will increase or decrease the texture area, whereas the contrast option will sharpen the edges of the texture. Reset the parameters. Selecting the texture each tip will add the texture on each brush step and works like a flow transparency. You can add randomness to the texture by adding the depth jitter. From the bottom control drop down, select the pen pressure and set the depth jitter to 0. Now draw a new stroke. Apply pressure to increase the texture effect. The texture effect depends on the pressure you apply on the pen tip. You can add minimum depth to your stroke. No matter how less pressure you give on the pen tip, the pen will produce the texture according to the minimum depth specified. Like the brush, we also can create our own texture or pattern. Just open any image from which you want to create a texture. For better results, your image should be black and white, or it will calculate the opacity depending on the dark or light pixels automatically. Remember that the dark pixels will be considered as the opaque area and light pixels as the transparent area. If you want the reverse effect, then don't worry, as we can reverse the effect by selecting the invert option anytime. Select the rectangular area you want to create texture from. Go to Edit and Define Pattern, giving it a name and press OK. Your pattern has been created. Go to the top drop down of the texture and select the recently created pattern. Try to paint with it. If you want to reverse the texture, then just select the invert option and then you can paint. You may need to adjust the depth every time you change the texture. You can create a new preset from the current settings by just clicking on the plus button on the top side. Open the texture selection window. You will find the new preset here. You can change the display style of textures from the top right gear icon menu. We also can load the legacy textures from older versions of Photoshop. Go to the Patterns panel and click on the top right icon. Select Legacy Patterns and More. Lots of more textures and patterns are loaded at the bottom. If you want to rename or delete any existing pattern, you right-click on the thumbnail and select an option. You can also define a new group and store new patterns inside it. You will find all options from the top right icon of the Patterns panel. Now let's see an important option of Protect Texture. For that, we need to define a new brush with current settings. Let's increase the brush size a little. Create a new brush preset. Give a name and save it. I have already saved a few texture brushes. When you select any texture brush, it will load the saved texture from the preset. But if you want to load only the brush settings and not the texture from it, the Protect Texture option is useful here. Select the Protect Texture option and click on the lock beside it. It will lock the texture. No matter which brush preset you load, it will keep the current texture with the brush. This option helps you to keep the same uniform texture across all your strokes. Now let's talk about relative questions. So what's the difference between defining a new brush and a new pattern? Well, you can define any shape as a brush, but you need an exact rectangle to define a pattern. Brush shape will repeat the stamp where you drag your mouse with specified spacing, whereas the pattern or texture stays still when you paint. The second question is, why do we need to protect the texture? Texture option can be useful for different purposes like filling a texture background, creating strokes to create object shadows, or sometimes to write text also. So for different purposes, we might need different brush tip or preset. But to keep the current texture same with all the brush presets, this option is very useful.